Greetings, students. I'm Dr. Sadri, your instructor for INR 2002. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about the topic of chapter 28, which, as you know, is terrorism and political violence. By the way, in our department, after you finish with this course, if you're really interested in that type of topic, we have actually a course that I teach from, time to time. It's called CPO 3057. It's called a contemporary revolution and political violence, in which we really focus on what revolutions and political violence. So if you're interested in that topic, that course is always available for available for you. All right. Having said that one, what I wanted to do is that was the cover slides. I hope that you have the PowerPoint open in front of you. Is that right? So on the slide number 2, as you can see, I have a summaries of what I want to make sure that you get out of these chapters, okay? I hope, by the way, these summaries that I've made and all the PowerPoints and everything, they've been helpful for you, because the publisher promised some stuff, but they didn't actually make the necessary arrangement for it, except, the quiz question and everything. So I hope everything makes a lot of sense. So here we go. Summaries of the content of the chapter. First of all, we start with an introduction, talking about terrorism in IR. Then we talk about types of terrorism. Then we talk about David Rappaport's, wave theory of terrorism. Then we try to explain the religious terrorism. Then after that, we try to explain the far-right terrorism. And then we, focus on the question what we know about terrorism and political violence. And last but certainly not least, we do what? We conclude, our thoughts about political violence and terrorism in world politics. Okay. Having said that one, then we wanted to know, okay, what are some of the learning objectives you should have? Here we go. You should be able to explain and understand terrorism, and terrorist motives. You should think about terrorism, in abstract and historically contextualize it with different ways. And then also you should have a grasp of the complexity of this whole notion of terrorism and terrorists nowadays, which seems to be a very wide, it's a growing phenomenon. Okay, so having said that one, let's talk a little bit about slide number 4, which is categorizing and defining terrorism. Well, terrorism has to do with violence. Is that right? I mean, there's no doubt about that one. Or the threat of violence, not just violence itself, but sometimes threat of violence in the pursuit of broad political aims and everything. And it's very interesting that here I would like to make a little pause and say that the authors of your text, they basically refers this whole phenomenon all the way back to 1789 French Revolution. They said that terrorism emerged as a concept following the 1789 French Revolution, when it became a tactic of the new revolutionary states. Okay. However, in reality, it shows a little bit about maybe they were not familiar with other civilizations, because in reality there were terrorists and terrorist activities even way before that, going all the way back to 11th and 12th century. I mean, I just give one example, but there have been obviously before that. For example, the whole group of the Niazaris, Ismailis order, okay, that they existed from 1090 to 1275, and it was founded by Hassan al-Sabah. Is that right? This guy and these people were basically assassins within the Islamic world, and when they didn't like something, they would kill a sultan or a king or whatever, or they create problems. So as you can see, maybe the best way for them to say what they said should have been, in the modern era, okay, terrorism emerged as a concept following the 1789 French Revolution, when it became the tactic of the new revolution. They shouldn't say like, oh, it's like, sometimes when you learn about international relation and the knowledge of the writer goes all the way just back to Greeks and Romans. Just like, well, there was no other civilization before Greeks and Romans, There were other civilizations, the Egyptian ones, which much older, Chinese one, Persian one, Mesopotamian one. You see, there are a lot of other ones, but because somebody doesn't know, it doesn't mean that, they have to make all these generalizations. Anyway, be very careful about that one, because if the questions are coming from the publisher, okay, all right, and then they ask you something particular, read the question very carefully. that if it's a question that talks about only the publisher's, or better to say author's argument, as opposed to the question that provides opportunity to the instructor like me who has presented their ideas or completed that idea. So read those things very, very carefully. Okay. Over time, we can say that understanding of terrorism is shifting. And it includes both theory and practice, not just theoretical, but also practice too. Something else that we should also mention is if this book that we are reading right now was written only in 1970s, we would be basically focusing mostly on leftist rejectionist of capitalism. Okay, that was a very hot topic then. Okay, or separatist, or separatist non-state actors that they want to have their own, country or something. But nowadays we focus on religious, revolutionaries and terrorists and far right. Okay, far right in our own country. We're going to talk about it toward the end of this. Okay, that's become one of the major concerns of FEI because I end up, doing a lot of consulting for different government agencies. So. All right, so religious, terrorism. Well, of course, I'm sure, that even those of you who were born after, is that right? Majority of you probably are, do not maybe have seen it. I witnessed it. I'm sure your parents witnessed it. Al-Qaeda's attack on World Trade Center and the Pentagon in 9/11, 2001 was a dramatic event in the life of us Americans, okay? It, of course, affected some other countries too, but, we lost almost 3,000 people. Is that right? And that brought up the whole notion of religious terrorism. But there have been also a lot of changes in that. In the 2 decades, after 2 decades of fighting terrorists, and especially people like Al-Qaeda, until finally Osama bin Laden, a few years ago was, killed, identified and killed. And then, his basically partner, al-Zawahiri, was also killed, basically getting rid of the top echelon of Al-Qaeda. It has changed a lot, but it also has changed the life of a lot of people, a lot of Americans and also Westerners, and a lot of also people in the Middle East, from Saudis and Afghans and Iraqis and Syrians and a lot of other people, okay? So I want you to understand that these things are not just things happening in the news. It can affect us. I've had some relatives died in, 9/11 because they were working in the World Trade Center. All right. Okay. Not with the same last name, but they were from my mother's side, so they had a different last name. Anyway, after 9/11, many Westerners have basically thought that, okay, so this is the major problem. That's what we have to focus on. And then President, George W. Bush, he declared actually a global war on terror. Is that right? That's what a lot of politicians do, and it kind of looks really good on the TV and, when they're, broadcasting the radio or something. But in reality, can be something very different. And that was basically a reaction to what? To, against Islamic terrorism, especially by what? Al-Qaeda and what we call later on Islamic State. Okay. So what has happened? Is that right? I want you to think about it, Take a minute, think about, okay, well, those things happened. Maybe I wasn't even there, or I was a little kid when that one happened. But what was it? All right. I can say that until 9/11, religious-based, terrorism was very rare in international relations. It wasn't something common, okay? But then after that, we see like a resurgent. Is that right? Different parts of the, world, and it had not just a regional dimension, it's a global dimension. When Al-Qaeda moved this and that, it wasn't just attack against U.S. They have also had some attacks in Africa. They've had attacks in Europe. They've had attacks in Asia. So it's not like, focus only on one area. All right. The other thing I want you to consider is international terrorism and political violence did not begin in 9/11. It went way beyond. But of course, your authors, they still consider it something that started with the European politics or whatever, but we know that it went way beyond that. Okay? Just think about it. Our founding fathers, is that right? From when you read the British literature, they don't refer, we love our founding fathers because we think that they were such brave people. They stood up to the superpower of the time. They stood up to British Empire. Okay? That's not an easy thing to do. That is not an easy thing to do. And we were not equal in terms of their in terms of our military capability. Right now, we are, and more than that, but we weren't. If you read a whole lot about, the War of Independence, you see, oh my goodness gracious, poor George Washington, is that right? First of all, there was not national army, so there were all these militias coming from different, colonies, territories, and everything else to help him. There was not much of a coordination, and every time they face to face met the British, military, militarily speaking, they were basically defeated. It's unbelievable how we got our independence. Okay, it was a miracle, to be honest with you. All right, I mean, when I studied that, because I studied as a political scientist and somebody interested in wars. All right, so I studied it. So anyway, I want you to consider those type of things. And then in the British literature, when you read about our founding fathers that we are so proud, they wouldn't say, "Oh yes, Americans are so brave and they stand up to our red, soldiers, etc., etc." They were saying Americans are a bunch of cowards, They hide behind the trees and they wear these outfits that, it matches the, forest or something, and they shoot. As our soldiers are, marching from one city to another, they shoot our soldiers and they escape. Well, because we had no other choice. Okay. Guerrilla warfare was basically one of the things we Americans invented. We invented it, all right? Because every time we stood up to them, they demolished us. So when you're weak, that's what you use. Is that right? It's not like, oh yeah, you are a crazy person. That's why you're using terrorism, guerrilla warfare. You just use it because you're underdog. You can't stand up. Okay. So in that regard, as I mentioned, is a new thing. However, it means that the current, band, and brands basically of Islamist terrorists, they have some particular notion a little bit different from previous period. And of course, it is a historical diversity in that regard, and that's how it's affecting international relations. Now, you might say, let's go to slide number 8. You might say, okay, what are the types of terrorism? Well, there are a lot of different things, and I try to organize it here for you. First of all, the terminology is a significant problem because when you're seeking to look at, for example, the issue of terrorism and political violence, it could mean different things to different people. Oh my goodness, can we have come up with some standard definition? So many names sometimes are used to refer to, for example, various political expression, and it changes sometimes from time to time. I leave this part of it to the chapter because I thought chapter was good in that regard. Also, when we focus on, for example, on religious extremists, of course, the first name that comes to our mind is what? Al-Qaeda. And then after that, what? Islamic State. Is that right? These are one thing, but there are also increasing number of secular terrorism. Okay? We see that one, as we mentioned later on, is what? The growth of the right, not just in America, but in Europe as well. Okay? All right, so now let's go to slide number 9. And here we are talking about state and sub-state terrorism. So one very famous terminology, I'm sure some of you have heard, is state terrorism. And in this case, this is when the states, they basically turn against and or, repress their own citizens. Okay, you can see that one, like for example, in China nowadays. China is repressing what? China that we know, we think all the Chinese are the same and they all speak the same language. That's not true, okay? There are like about at least, 40, 50 different type of ethnic groups living in China. Is that right? Now, the most commons are what we call Huns. Is that right? And even those guys, they have what? 2 different type of Mandarin and Cantonese. Those are the 2 main dialect of what we call Chinese. Is that right? But they also have people from completely different ethnic groups. As you know, in China, there are people from Tibet. Tibetan, they're not Chinese, ethnically speaking. They don't speak that language. They speak a different language, okay? Also, the Uyghurs, is that right? Which is basically the Muslim version of the Chinese, and they live in Xinjiang province. So the way China is treating their own citizens, they were born and raised there, they're Chinese, but they have a different ethnicity and different religion. It's horrible. They're sending them to, they kill a lot of their leaders. They send their kids to supposedly re-education camps. You know what I mean? And this is happening what? In 21st century. This is happening right now. I'm not talking about past. I'm talking about now. I'm bringing you all the way up to present. So the next notion is sub-state, terrorism, which involves rebellions or revolutions, or sometimes respond here and there, and sometimes it happens in certain areas. Like what? Like in Colombia. Is that right? Like as I mentioned, in Tibet. Okay, now let's go to slide number 10. I give you a second to catch up. Are you there yet? Okay, hopefully you're there. So slide number 10, we talk about state-sponsored terrorism. Is that right? So this is a category that is notorious difficult to find example, which basically, they would agree that the amount, it depends on the spot, the amount, depends on to state-sponsored terrorism and how you define it, how you think about it, No matter how you think about it, at least from the perspective of our government, U.S. State Department has a list of state-sponsored terrorists, And in that regard, there are three separate laws that they deal with it. I'm going to go over each one of these ones. I mention it. I leave the definition to the text, because I know that sometimes you get confused on these. Okay. Law number 1 is the Export Administration Act, which came out in 1979. The second one is the Arms Export Control Act, which came out in 1976. And last but certainly not least, these are the major ones though, is that right? And the classical ones, is the Foreign Assistance Act, which came out in 1961. So those are the things you could, by the way, that makes a very good short answer question, doesn't it? Because I know some of you have asked me, Dr. Sadi, how come you don't give us, like study guide? My whole PowerPoints are your study guide. Did you notice an exam 1, exam 2? Basically all the short answers and essay questions were coming from what? From my own lectures. I'm really hoping you're watching these videos, okay? Next one, in terms of continuation with the whole notion of state-sponsored terrorism, in 2021, the list of the, state-sponsored terrorist thing of the State Department will include 4 countries, okay? Cuba, Iran, North Korea, and Syria. But these are added to what? To some former, list, which the former list included Iraq, Libya, South Yemen, and what? Sudan. So, if this is the case, how does at least our government, because at least you should know, I don't expect you to know the rules of every single country on the world, is that right? But at least you should know something about our country, is that right? So we have 4 types of sanctioning, according to State Department. Sanction number 1 is constrains U.S. foreign policy assistance. In other words, if you're acting like this, most likely we're not going to give you some kind of foreign aid. 2, prohibition of military export and sales. If you're like that, we're not going to sell you weapons, because you could use the weapons to kill other people. You see? Number 3, various controls over the export of dual-use military civilian items. Okay, sometimes we can sell you, for example, let's say some kind of drones, and you can use the drones to go up and try to find out some water sources or something. Is that right? Or where is the forest, or where is the border of this and that? Well, that has a civilian function. Guess what? You can also use it right now, as I mentioned. You can use drones in what? Any kind of warfare or terrorist activity. Last but certainly not least, a few other financial and other restrictions have been also added. All right, enough about this one. Again, notice that we are touching the surface. Each one of these topics, I can go way into details, which I'm not. I just want to make sure that you have a general idea. You read the book. Do not just, yes, I'm encouraging you to watch the videos, okay? Because I try to make it easier for you to digest. But you still need to read the chapters, okay? And read all those chapter summaries and everything. But the chapter summaries that I'm making for you, I'm not making summary chapters that is as long as the chapter. It's usually 1 or 2 paragraphs, okay? Depending on how challenging that chapter is. Okay, slide number 12 talks about ethno-nationalist terrorism. This involves conflict between groups separated by identity, okay? We have seen this one, for example, in friendly countries that we have, like Turkey. In Turkey, there has always been a conflict between the Turks and the Kurds. Kurds, I'm sure you've heard, is that right? Because you usually hear Kurds about Iraq or sometimes Iran. But actually, Kurds are a very, very large ethnic group in the Middle East, that their territory is basically divided among 5 countries. Majority of them are in Turkey. Good segment of them are in northern part of Iraq. So Turkey, eastern part of Turkey, northern part of Iraq, western part of Iran, and, little tail of Syria. Is that right? When you look at the map, there is a little tail of it over there. And last but not least, even a little bit of them in Armenia. You see? So here we go. Goodness gracious, okay? So that can cause trouble sometimes between that minority and the dominant minority in those countries. So as you know, not only the Kurds have been fighting the Turks for some kind of independence and some kind of benefits or something, they did the same thing during Saddam Hussein with Iraq. Is that right? Where they were fighting the Arabs, right there. And then from time to time in Iran, you hear that between Kurds and the Persians, Sometimes you hear about the Kurds and the Arabs in Syria, and sometimes between Kurds and Armenians in Armenia. So that exists. I just want you to know that, and I think that's a very good example. All right. The rationale for association of these violences is very important. How does this one happen? What is the beginning of it? What's the end of it? Also, there are some, let me give you some other also examples. And one example, at least from Europe, here we go. And that would include Provincial Irish Republican Army, or IRA, is that right? Which, as you know, the loyalists of it, they were fighting with the loyalist, Irish, that they were loyalists to what? Great Britain, is that right? I mean, just think about it. Just think about all the wars between the Irish and the what, and the British, which eventually, thank goodness, with the Good Friday, treaty, was finally came to a peace after decades and decades of killing each other. Is that right? Nowadays, we have the same situation right now going on between the Burmese Buddhist and nationalists, that they treat other minorities bad. They have a Christian minority, Karen's minority, they treat them bad. I'm sure you have heard about they're killing a lot of the Muslim Rahinas, So these type of issues are not limited to one or two countries. Unfortunately, we can see it in a lot of different places. What about the, slide number 13? Is that right? Political terrorism. Can you get there? Okay. Now, focusing on slide number 13, ideologically, sometimes this is motivated. Is that right? And it can have a leftist ideology. It could have a rightist ideology. So I wanted to tell you that it is not like in the past that it was only, capitalism versus communism, or socialism versus capitalism, or something like that. No, it has a lot of different dimensions. And we should also consider that, for example, what the, classical example, again, from Europe, maybe, that would be maybe good, because you have been using some other ones. I want you to be open to all these different examples. Nazis ruled in France during World War II, is that right? That they persisted and they executed a lot of the opposition and everything else. That's also a kind of what? Political terrorism. Guess what? Sometimes the struggle of the other side is not considered terrorism. So in other words, somebody's terrorist is somebody else's freedom fighter. Like what we refer to our founding fathers as freedom fighters. The British, they were not using the term terrorists. They were just saying a bunch of cowards, Americans, that they hide and everything else. Well, there are other terms for it. Let me, for example, since we talked about Europe, let's focus about France. Is that right? I told you what the Nazis did in France, okay? Killing a lot of the people, sending a bunch of people to concentration camp and everything. However, the French resistance movement, is that right? What did they do? They also terrorized the Nazis. They killed a lot of Nazis. They resisted, okay? They are not considered terrorists. They are considered, heroic freedom fighters, okay? So I'm telling you this one because I want my student, as student of international relations, to have an open mind and look at things from an initial perspective, because different things means different to different people. All right, I don't judge you. Don't worry. Okay, I just, as a professor, and I don't have any agenda. It's my job to what? Introduce these concepts to you. All right, next one, slide number 14, eco-terrorism. Eco-terrorism has been very much in the news, especially when we are talking about these are people who are opposite to animal testing. Is that right? Or eradication of certain type of biological unit. Like, for example, the work that Greenpeace did to what? To fight against whaling and everything, because there were certain type of whale were almost extinguished, My goodness gracious, it's only in the last couple of decades that whale population is coming back. The whales are a part of, do you remember we talked about environmental stuff? It's a part of this whole huge biological unit we call planet Earth. Every single animal, every single plant, including us as humans, has a particular function in this biological cycle, okay? We are smarter, and suddenly we've increased our population up to right now, which is more than 8 billion, So, in fact, last night I was watching this, PBS program, And I noticed that they were talking about human beings in the last several decades. They have basically destroyed half of the world's, forest. For what? To make it agricultural land. Why? Because we need to produce food. What are you going to do? You're going to produce food in the labs? Well, there are some people who do that, but it still is not very common. So they've cut down all those trees. So can you imagine, by cutting all those trees, how much it has affected that environment? And it has, Okay. Next type of terrorism we want to talk about is the cyber terrorism, which I'm sure you hear about it all the time. Is that right? There's a cyber attack against our power station. There's cyber attack against, of course, our government agencies. There's cyber attack against, travel companies, for God's sake, messing up people's plans, or airlines or something like that. So, in that regard, we can say that there are some examples that I'm going to give you some, I could say, for example, I mentioned 3 out of 5. Is that right? Example mentioned right here. Hacking into the computer system, introducing viruses into vulnerable networks, website, defacing, denial of services attacks, and terrorist threats made via, electronic communication. These are all very important, okay? So, ready, guys? Now I wanted to go and talk about Professor Rappaport's idea. That's on slide number 15. Just want to make sure that you are in the same slide with me. Okay. As you can see, he even published a book called The Waves of Global Terrorism, blah, blah, blah. He's very well known. Okay. So David Rappaport contains that modern terrorism began in the late 19th century and has, see, I like this term better, modern terrorism. Is that right? So at least he recognizes that maybe there's some other form of terrorism before. I just hope that he realizes that way before Europe, there was also terrorism some other places too. That began in 19th century and has a distinct characteristic. He asserts that time and the changing characteristic of international politics context has given it what? Terrorism has a cyclical character, according to Professor Rappaport. Okay, Rappaport terms this a wave. Okay, he defines it as a cycle of activity in a given time period and characterized by phases of both expansion and contraction. Expansion, contraction, expansion, contraction. And a critical feature of each of these is international, it's international character. So those are the things that what he's very much concerned. All right, enough about that aspect of it. Let's go and talk about number 16. Slide number 16. Is that right? Explaining foreign, and religious, terrorism. What happened in the real world is important for theoretician. Is that right? And that includes usually not just terrorism, but also political violence. So, with the 1979 Iranian Revolution, the whole idea of religious extremism came to what? Came to people's TV stations. People are watching, Iranian students holding, American, diplomats as hostage. So this was something new because you could see it in the foreign policy of the country. And sometimes you would see that sometimes the students were a little bit more excited about some stuff than what? Than the leaders. The leaders were kind of caught. The neutral leader at the time was Prime Minister Bazargan of Iran. And, he just basically was talking to the students and says, look, you cannot do something like that because our government, which has gone through a revolution, the students wouldn't even listen to him. They wouldn't listen to him, but they would listen to Ayatollah Khomeini. So basically, that was a way for the first government of Iran to change, to become more and more what? Religious. Because first they were secular. All right? So here we go. That has become an issue. 2 decades later, we see, okay, right after Iran, there were other type of what? Religious extremists. What? Al-Qaeda, which led to 9/11 and became the focus of the basically West. Is that right? But beyond that one, we can say that thinking about, extremists only in religious fracture is only part of the truth. It's not the whole thing. My friends in FBI, they basically say that right now, to be honest with you, they are much more concerned about not so much terrorism coming from outside to our country, but terrorism within our own country. Terrorism done by, unfortunately, American citizens. Okay. And in that regard, they are very much concerned about the far right. Okay? So following several decades, that they started focusing on religious, and Islamic, particularly terrorism. Right now, the attention is mostly on the far right terrorism, which is growing not just in the U.S. It's growing in other countries too, Western countries too. And interesting enough, some of it started with very, very basic stuff. First, like some conservative parties, it would get, come to power, like the Conservative Party in Hungary. Is that right? With, their recent president and everything that has, he's a part of supposedly Western alliance and everything. And some of the stuff he says is just not acceptable, I mean, in 21st century. It's just completely politically wrong. Is that right? I mean, he talks about some of the stuff that like basically Nazis were talking about, and we went to a war for them, against them. Is that right? To free people. But he just basically hates all the immigrants, hate this, hate that. Well, a lot of those immigrants that they came actually to Europe, they were highly educated people, okay? And a lot of European countries actually benefited from that. When, for example, Afghanistan, Iran, Syria, they had revolutions or invasions by Soviets or, change of this system from secular to religious, a lot of the educated people left, and you can see a lot of these educated people having wonderful jobs in countries like Sweden, other Scandinavians, Central Europeans like France and Germany and other places, But anyway, I think sometimes these things that you use these things as a excuse, to unite the people or change the attention of the people. So I'm not going to get into that part of it. I'll leave it to you. I want you to look at it. But there is no one general rule, though. Case by case. All right? Back to our country, of course, your text is talking about the Proud Boys. Is that right? Which also contributed to the whole notion of the January 6th, attack on a U.S. Congress. To be honest with you, as a person who has, when he was a kid with his parents, we immigrated to the U.S., we came here with political asylum, okay? Because of the fact that a lot of our relatives were killed for their political and religious beliefs and everything. We always thought that there is a lot of respect for what? There is a lot of respect for different political point of views and everything else. And instead of shooting one another or being aggressive or something, issues can be resolved in a diplomatic way. And January 6th and people running over there and trying to kill members of Congress and destroying this and that has been embarrassing. It's embarrassing because our enemies like Putin of Russia and President Xi of China, they say, see, you tell us that Western democracies is so great. Look at that. Before you tell us, you change, you should, clean up your own house. In other words, they tell us shut up because they see people acting like this, I'm a professor of diplomacy. What do you expect me to say? I'm not going to encourage you to go and do act of violence. I'm going to say that negotiate, talk, try to resolve it with some kind of compromise or diplomacy. That's what I would teach. Anyway, but that's me. All right. So slide number 18. Okay. What we know about, terrorism and political violence. Well, one of the things that we need to focus on that we have to argue about the terrorism and that has a rationality of its own. Is that right? It undergone a lot of causes and beliefs, and the rationality is not whatever everyone else might see in terms of their activities. One thing we can say is whoever they are in every aspect, they are usually in an extreme form of that particular, perspective that they're promoting, or that particular, for example, support for that ethnic group or religious ideas or something like that. So in that regard, we can say that following these points, this should tell us something about what terrorism is all about. Okay. So what are some of the observations? Slide number 19. What's the observation about terrorism and political violence? We can say at least 3 points about this one. I organize it for you on that slide. If we define terrorism as a illegitimate use of or misuse of violence, then it sometimes carries out by states. That's one thing. 2, non-state terrorism is typically a weapon of weak against the what? Status quo, against the powerful, which is what I told you before. So I'm kind of summarizing some of the things that I've been mentioning in this, lecture. And then despite the claim that terrorism is a matter of, perspective and everything is being, relatively and finally impossible to justify, we need to consider one thing, and that is to kill, a policy of killing civilian is usually because they have some political goals. Who? Terrorists, not ordinary people. Is that right? So how do we conclude? Slide number 20, the last slide. We can say that the key focus both of governments and for future researchers is to discover what are the causes of terrorism. Our generation, we have done the best to identify it. I'm hoping that some of you get excited about these type of topics. Some of you want to follow more with political science, and after you finish your BA, go get a master's, get a PhD, and really study these things with fresh perspective, okay? Because we have done whatever we could. I actually wrote my dissertation about that. I wrote about revolutionary states, okay? It published actually later on. You can Google it and find it. And don't ever buy things like that, okay? Just go always to the library and borrow it. Why should you buy when there are libraries and they have copies of it? Okay, so one other thing that I wanted to mention, and this should be really studied more, we say some general things about this far right, terrorism and everything. We need to discover more reasons for that. One of the general reasons for it is far right is so much concerned about immigration and people coming from other places, and they feel like maybe they're becoming a minority in their own country, things like that. Of course, the long-term solution to that would be education, but I think there are also a lot of other factors involved, and it would be kind of nice if your generation, you focus on these things. So, but fear of immigration, guys, has been usually one of those cases. But if this is the case, we need to consider that our country is an immigrant country. Is that right? And then luckily, when immigrants, they come to our country, very soon they try to learn the language, which is good. Is that right? They try to learn a general thing about American political culture, American general culture or something, even though they try to celebrate their own, heritage. Like look at Italian Americans, is that right? Look at, for example, the Chinese Americans, the Japanese Americans, the Jewish Americans, the Arab Americans, is that right? From each group we have learned something. You talk about feng shui, you're thinking about Japanese American. We talk about sushi, Japanese American, is that right? We think about, for example, all those delicious Chinese food and celebration and the whole notion of, yin and yang has come from the Chinese. We talk about, for example, excellent, pasta dishes and music and accordions and I don't know, tons of other stuff. Italian Americans, is that right? We think about, the essence of many of our Christian ideas, which goes back to Judaism, is that right? The contribution of the Jewish Americans. We think about things nowadays, like everywhere you go, you see a hookah, cafe, people are smoking. I'm not into smoking, but I've seen it everywhere, all over, even here in Orlando. And then, for example, you see things added to our diet like hummus, is that right? Which is basically an Arabic, a dish, falafel, things like that from different Arab countries. You see, that's something. So what I'm trying to tell you is the strength of our country is immigration. Because every time these groups of people come over there, is that right? And then mix up with this, we're coming up with newer and newer ideas. Of course, there were other groups too. Like, for example, right now there is a lot of attention of people coming south of the border. But we have had Mexican Americans, and so many of us, we enjoy Mexican food. Is that right? And so us enjoy, for example, knowing Spanish, or, in my school back in Arizona, Spanish was basically the second language. In some parts of my home state, Spanish was the main language. I heard, and sometimes when I go to South Florida, it seems like, guess what? Spanish is also the dominant language over there too. So, it's a good thing to be familiar with other languages, other food, other way of thinking. Is that right? What is one of the strengths of our country is, look, people, they can copy our hardware, like in terms of cell phone and everything, is software. Software is very sophisticated in our country because a lot of our people, they think multidimensionally. How do they do that? Because their parents coming from, different groups and everything else. Look, every American refers to himself, I'm a Heinz 57. I'm this person French, that person Native American, that person German, that person, I don't know, Irish, or for example, Arab or Jewish, or, you see, that is strength of a country, stays together. Okay? Look at some of the other countries that they are fighting one another when these groups are separate from one another. They lose a lot. We are hoping that we can come up with a solution to these problems so nobody would suffer. Okay, I went over a lot of issues. If you still have questions, you know what to do. Email me. Thank you.